Chayton stood at the edge of the land with both hands raised and his voice low enough that the men behind him had to lean forward just to catch the words, and every single one of them went still the moment he spoke. He told the cowboy to leave. He said it plainly and without anger, the way a man speaks when he is not making a threat but stating something older than any argument either of them could have. The cowboy did not move. He stood with his hat in both hands and looked at the Apache chief directly, and the two of them held that silence between them like something neither was willing to drop. The men at the edge of the street watched and waited, some of them certain the cowboy would back down, others certain something very different was about to happen. But it was the chief's final words, spoken quietly and only once, that stopped every man in that crowd so completely that no one moved or spoke for a long time afterward, because what Chayton said next was not a warning at all. What the Apache chief knew about that land, and why he had ridden 3 days to reach it, was something no one in the town of Harrow Bend had thought to ask before that morning. The cowboy had been working the property for 2 weeks by then, and in those 2 weeks not a single person had come to him with curiosity rather than ridicule. But Chayton had not come with ridicule, and he had not come with anger, and the fact that he had come at all meant that something buried beneath that ground was worth riding 3 days to reach. What the cowboy had felt when he first stood on that land, that quiet certainty that most men would have dismissed as foolishness, was apparently something an Apache chief had felt from 100 miles away. The question was not whether the cowboy was wrong. The question was what both of them were standing on top of, and how long it had been waiting for someone to finally stop walking past it and pay attention. The answer to that question would change everything anyone in Harrow Bend believed about the land beneath their feet. Harrow Bend sat in a wide valley between two ridgelines, and it was the kind of town where a man could sneeze at one end of the main street and someone at the other end would already know about it before he finished wiping his face. There were maybe 300 people living in or near it at the time, and most of them had been there long enough to believe they understood everything that land had to offer, which was a particular kind of certainty that left very little room for surprise. The cowboy's name was Eli Vance, and he was not the kind of man who announced himself when he walked into a room. He was lean and weather-worn, with hands that looked like they had spent most of their years gripping something difficult, and his eyes were the kind of calm that comes not from ease but from years of choosing patience over reaction. He had come to Harrow Bend 2 years earlier with a small amount of savings and a reputation for doing steady work without complaint, and he had earned enough respect from the people who mattered to him to live quietly and without trouble. When his uncle passed and left him a deed to 40 acres of flat, rocky ground east of town, everyone in Harrow Bend agreed on what he should do with it. The land was poor for farming and awkward for grazing, and there was a man in town who had already offered a fair price for it before the deed even reached Eli's hands. The sensible thing, the obvious thing, was to sell. Instead, Eli Vance rode out to the 40 acres on a Tuesday morning and started clearing stones from the surface with his own hands. No one understood why. By Wednesday, the story had made it through the saloon, the general store, and at least 4 front porches, and not one version of it was kind. Franklin Holt heard about it at the saloon and laughed in a way that filled the room. Holt was the wealthiest man in the valley, broad-shouldered and polished in a way that made other men feel underdressed simply by standing near him, and he had not been surprised by very many things in a long time. He said that Eli Vance must have rocks in his head to match the ones he was moving, and the room laughed with him, because when Franklin Holt said something, agreeing was easier than thinking. On his 3rd day working alone, Eli moved enough stone to clear a wide stretch near the eastern edge of the property. A young woman named Clara, who ran the dry goods counter and had never said a thoughtless word in her life, walked past the road's edge and watched him for a moment with something in her expression that was not mockery. She almost called out to him. She did not. She simply walked on, and the question she almost asked stayed with her for the rest of that week. Eli's uncle had told him something once that Eli had carried for years without fully understanding it, some ground holds more than what you can see from the road. On the 9th day, a rider named Dex Pruitt came into Harrow Bend from the east road moving faster than usual, and he pulled up in front of the saloon and said there were Apache riders coming down the ridge trail and they were not moving like men in a hurry, which somehow made them more worth paying attention to than if they had been. The news passed through the town in under 10 minutes. Some people came to their doorways. Others stayed back and watched from windows. Franklin Holt stepped out of the land office and stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression of a man who does not intend to be impressed. From the edge of town, the riders were visible first as shapes against the ridge, 6 of them, moving in a single steady line with a calm that had nothing to do with slowness and everything to do with certainty. As they came closer, it became clear that they were dressed for travel, not ceremony, and that their horses moved quietly beneath them as if the animals shared the riders' unhurried purpose. There was no display in them. No raised voices. No gestures. They simply came toward town as if they had known for a long time where they were going. They stopped at the eastern edge of the main road, exactly at the point where the path turned toward Eli Vance's 40 acres, and that specific stopping point caused several men in the crowd to exchange looks without speaking. The man who dismounted first was the one Eli would later know as Chayton. He was older, perhaps 60, perhaps older than that, with a face that had been shaped by a great deal of weather and a great deal of thought, and his hands were large and still at his sides. He moved from his horse to the ground slowly, not from difficulty but from the same calm that everything about him carried, and when he stood upright and looked at the gathered crowd it was without challenge or performance of any kind. His eyes moved across the faces in front of him and settled on Eli Vance with a directness that made 2 or 3 men step back slightly without understanding why they had done it. He introduced himself as Chayton in a voice that was neither loud nor soft but simply present, and then he walked past the crowd and onto the cleared ground of Eli's property without asking permission, which was not rudeness, it was something more like certainty. He walked the cleared area slowly, looking at the ground rather than the people watching him. He stopped at 3 points. At each one, he crouched briefly and touched the earth with 2 fingers, then stood again and moved on. A man near Franklin Holt said something low and dismissive, and Chayton did not look up or pause or change his pace in any way. He simply continued walking as if the comment had been made in a language he did not speak. When Chayton finally stood still and faced Eli, he said, *, this land was not sleeping. It was waiting. *. Eli looked at him for a long moment. *, waiting for what? *. Chayton looked at the ground between them. *, for someone who did not sell it. *. Then he knelt beside a particular flat stone near the center of the cleared area and placed both hands on it and said nothing more. The following morning, Chayton returned with 2 older men whose ages were difficult to place but whose stillness was even deeper than his own, and the 3 of them arrived before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Word moved through Harrow Bend quickly, and by the time the light was full, most of the town had gathered at the road's edge without having been told to gather there. Even Franklin Holt was present, though he stood slightly apart from the others with his hat pulled lower than usual. The mood of the crowd had changed from the day before in a way that was difficult to name. The laughter that had come easily for 2 weeks had gone quiet without anyone deciding to quiet it. The 3 Apache men worked with a short-handled tool in their hands, moving carefully through the cleared ground near the stone where Chayton had knelt the evening before. The earth in that area was harder than it looked, and it resisted them for a time before it gave way. Layer 1 *. What came up first were stones, not loose stones like the ones Eli had been clearing from the surface, but flat, shaped ones, each one roughly the same size, arranged in a pattern that was not natural. They were pale and smooth on top and rough on their undersides, and the way they sat against each other made it clear they had been placed by hands and not water or weather. The first elder lifted one and turned it slowly. He set it down beside the others and remained crouched, very still, looking at the arrangement for a long time before standing. Layer 2 *. When the digging continued past the stone layer, what they found beneath was harder to understand at first, a series of narrow channels cut into the firm clay beneath, each one running in a direction that matched the others, as if following a logic that was larger than any single one of them. The crowd at the road's edge had been talking in low voices until that moment, but when the channels became visible, the talking stopped. Layer 3 *. By midday, enough of the area had been cleared that the full pattern became visible to anyone looking down from the slight rise at the road's edge. It was a circle, large enough that it took several long paces to cross, with 4 points extending outward from it in directions that corresponded to something old and deliberate. From above, it looked like a place that had been designed to be found, not hidden, by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve a thing is to put it underground and trust the ground to hold it. Every man in the crowd was completely silent. Franklin Holt had not moved from his position at the edge, but his arms were no longer crossed. Layer 4 * Chayton stood at the center of the uncovered circle and faced the crowd, and what he said was this, *, what is buried by silence does not disappear. It waits for the one who is willing to stand on it without knowing what it is and believe it is worth staying for. *. No one in the crowd answered him. No one looked at anyone else. The words settled over the gathered men and women the way the last light of a long day settles over open ground, not dramatically, but completely. Layer 5 * 2 days after that, a man arrived from the Territorial Records Office with another man who introduced himself as a historian connected to the University at Santa Fe. They examined the circle for most of a morning, and when they produced an old surveyor's map from a leather case, it showed a marked site in this valley that had been recorded once in 1847 and then filed away and never followed up on, a site the map identified as a ceremonial and gathering place predating every structure in the valley by more than 2 centuries. What the map contradicted was simple and significant. The town of Harrow Bend had been built with the shared understanding that this valley had been empty and unused before settlers arrived. The circle said otherwise, and said it in a language that did not need translation. The official confirmation came quietly, without ceremony, from the historian, who said the site was significant enough to warrant formal preservation and study. He said it directly to Eli Vance, who was standing at the edge of the cleared circle with his hat in his hands, the same way he had stood when Chayton first arrived. Across each of these moments, Franklin Holt's posture had shifted in increments too small to point at individually but too large to miss if you had been watching from the beginning. His shoulders had come forward. His hat had been removed and turned in his hands and replaced more than once. When the historian's words landed, Holt walked toward Eli at the edge of the circle and said in a low voice that the whole thing could still be dissolved, that he would make the offer again, a better one, and that Eli should consider carefully. Eli looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the circle. No. He turned back to his work, and Holt stood alone for a moment before walking back to the road without speaking to anyone. That evening, Eli sat at the edge of the uncovered circle as the last light moved across the valley, and he looked at what the ground had been holding for 200 years without complaint, and he began to understand that his uncle had not left him 40 acres of rocky, poor land. He had left him a responsibility. By the following spring, the site at the eastern edge of Harrow Bend looked almost nothing like the flat, stone-scattered ground Eli had first cleared with his own hands. Careful markers had been placed at the circle's 4 points by the historians working alongside Chayton and the 2 elder men, and the 3 Apache men visited twice that season to add to the record of what the site had meant and to whom it had once belonged. On the second visit, Chayton sat with the younger historian for most of an afternoon and spoke slowly while the historian wrote, and the things he said were recorded and filed alongside the old surveyor's map, so that both voices were now part of the same document. The people of Harrow Bend did not speak about the land east of town the same way anymore. What had been called poor ground and wasted land was now spoken of with a carefulness that had not been there before, the way people speak about something they nearly walked past without seeing. Eli was at the edge of the site on a morning in late March when a man named Amos Greer, who had laughed at the saloon the day Franklin Holt made his joke, walked up beside him and stood for a moment. Then Amos said, I wouldn't have stayed. Eli nodded once. Most don't. Chayton came up beside Eli later that same morning, and the two of them stood without speaking for a stretch of time that was not uncomfortable. Then Chayton said, You were not like the others. Eli looked at the circle and then at the ground in front of it. I almost was. Chayton turned to him. No. Others do not stop to listen. Eli looked across the land and saw what it was now, a place that had been returned to its own history, a place with a voice that the whole valley could finally hear, because one man had stayed long enough to let it speak. Franklin Holt was seen that same morning on horseback, moving along the far ridge above the valley, alone. He did not ride toward the sight. The certainty he had carried for most of his life had not left him loudly or all at once, it had simply grown quieter with each thing the ground had revealed, until there was very little of it left to carry. Eli stood at the exact center of the circle where the first shaped stone had been lifted from the earth, and the ground beneath him was still and solid and full of something that had been waiting a very long time to be recognized. He heard his uncle's words again, "Some ground holds more than what you can see from the road," and understood for the first time that his uncle had not been speaking about this land specifically. He had been speaking about every decision a man makes when he cannot yet see where it leads. Eli Vance did not become known as the wealthiest man in Harrow Bend or the most celebrated. He became remembered for one thing: he stayed when staying made no sense to anyone watching, and he listened when listening required giving up the easier and more profitable path. He chose the ground over the payment, the unknown over the comfortable, and the patience to wait for what the land had to say over the certainty of a fast and reasonable decision. If you were in Eli's place, the whole town laughing, a fair offer on the table, and nothing but your own quiet feeling telling you to stay, would you have held on, or would you have taken the money and walked away like everyone expected? Write your answer in the comments below. Because sometimes the most important things in this life are not found by the fastest or the loudest, they are found by the one who was willing to be still long enough to hear them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. There are always more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next story.